Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Are you a mental health professional looking to deepen your clinical expertise in healing complex trauma? We're thrilled to announce our 2025 NARM therapist trainings designed to provide you with transformative training in the neuroaffective relational model. In 2025, we're offering 2 online cohorts for the Level 2 NARM therapist trainings. Our spring online cohort spans January to November 2025, and the summer online cohort runs May to December 2025. Through this advanced clinical training, you'll learn how to confidently and compassionately heal the impact of adverse childhood experiences, complex trauma, and CPTSD. You'll gain specialized trauma-informed training that supports the resolution of attachment, developmental, relational, cultural, and intergenerational trauma. Enrollment is open to licensed psychotherapists, counselors, social workers, and other licensed mental health professionals, as well as graduate trainees and interns working toward licensure. Join us and experience the integration of a neurobiologically informed clinical approach that promotes post-traumatic growth. Become part of a community where mindfulness meets clinical expertise and embody professional and personal growth as a catalyst for transformation in your practice and community. Visit complextraumatrainingcenter.com to register for the 2025 NARM therapist training that best fits your schedule. We hope you will join us to learn how NARM can transform your practice. And now for our interview. Karen Ihrig is a licensed clinical social worker in private practice in Phoenix, Arizona. She is a neuroqueer artist, griever, and psychotherapist who began practicing therapy after completing her master's in social work in 2012. Karen has an eclectic approach to therapy, specializing in traumatic grief, expressive arts, and complex trauma. Her practice, Here With You Therapy, has a niche providing therapy to the neurodivergent, LGBTQ+, consensually non-monogamous, and non-traditional communities. Her work is rooted in the intention to co-create an anti-oppressive, compassionate, and secure relational space with her expansive clients who have often endured marginalization, complex trauma, and traumatic bereavement. Karen believes in the transformative healing power of intersubjective presence. She is truly honored to be together with her clients, colleagues, and communities in shared humanity. Please enjoy my conversation with Karen Ihrig. Okay, I'm sitting here with my friend Karen Ihrig. Karen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, and I wanted to let listeners know that we are friends. I feel so fortunate that I met you through the NARM community, so this is one of the perks. I get to bring my friends in here sometimes and we get to have a conversation.
I love our connection.
Yeah. So I'm curious, as always, wondering what you would like our listeners to come away with from our conversation today.
Yes, so I know we'll be talking and diving into the topic of grief. And I have this quote that I like to share that kind of sets my intention from Francis Weller, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. Those who undertake the full journey into their grief come back carrying the medicine for the world. And part of my intention is just to invite us to explore the depth and relationship of our own grief in this very grief avoidant, grief adverse society that often tells us how we should grieve, gives us messaging about what we should and shouldn't be doing. But as clinicians and providers, our own relationship to our depth of belonging, of grief, really impacts how we can connect and show up for others who are grieving.
Thank you. I love that book. And I love that quote, and I appreciate you bringing it. It really helped me just kind of drop into my heart and feel into the intention for today. So thank you. So if we can, just to share with listeners a little bit about you and where you're from and how you got into the field, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I'm born and raised in Arizona, Phoenix metropolitan area, Tempe, and I have quite a history of mental illness in my family, being parentified pretty early. I feel like I've been a very empathetic person since the start. And so it felt really natural for me to go into the field. From a NARM perspective, we can look on the connection and disconnection of that, familiar or a calling, but it was just a really strong pull for me to step into roles in social work. I started in sociology in undergrad and then moved into like being direct staff at residential treatment care for youth, and had a whole season of expressive arts where I worked in a company that was focused on providing expressive arts therapy for all sorts of humans coming in. And that felt really good for a good amount of time, very connected to art. And then moved towards more school-based roles with working with youth and families in more of a community type setting. And then found NARM, and that changed everything. And did my own personal work in NARM for a couple years of my own therapy, and then started my level 2 training as a therapist. And now I'm finishing up master's, and I'm going to be a co-TA for the 2025 level 2. And yeah, it's just been this beautiful journey of finding NARM, and it's been such a glorious fit for me. It's really revitalized me, the community and the approach, and I really feel so much more of myself and so much more connected to my own depths and my own experience of this work. And after finding NARM and training, I moved into my own private practice, which blends all of these passions I have. So expressive arts, I work in traumatic grief care. I'm a compassionate bereavement care provider. And the foundation of my practice uses NARM as the primary intervention.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, and I don't want to miss too, I'm a neuroqueer therapist, so neurodivergent, queer community, non-traditional relationship style. And a lot of my clients who come in are people who have complex trauma and who are very diverse and expansive, but within society have experienced harm, a sense of not belonging, marginalization, discrimination, all of that. And a lot of my clients also the juxtaposition of being traumatically bereaved amongst that.
So important, the work you're doing. And I appreciate that you're naming all those intersections and how you utilize NARM. Well, hopefully we'll get into more how you utilize NARM in those ways. So the thing I had talked to you previously before we press record, one thing that I've been really curious in our friendship and that we haven't really had much of conversation around and explored is the way that you show up for grievers. And I would love to hear more about that. And you mentioned how you got into the field, but I am curious if you can be a little more specific. How did you get specifically into grief work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I had a traumatic loss in 2010. I lost an unborn child, and that shook me. I was really amongst the acute traumatic loss of that and felt very othered and didn't feel very held in my experience other than a few close family members or friends. But I had the sense that society didn't acknowledge or accept my grief. And then I was in grad school at the time for social work, and I took a traumatic bereavement class from Joanne Cacciatore, who does the MISS Foundation. And her foundation is centered in the traumatic bereavement of her daughter, Cheyenne, in honor of her. And so I felt very supported in learning the work, like learning the approach, her attend grief model. And it felt like I had this container for my experience, while also it was excruciating. But on the other side of that, being with my own grief, being in relationship to it, learning about it, experiencing other people's grief where they were openly sharing about their process and inviting us in with such a beautiful connection into their own story and their own heart. I really deepened into the sense of how important this work is and how meaningful it is to be present and have this openness to exist together in the experience of the loss. And then throughout time, that was 2010, I've continuously grounded and anchored in my own experience of grief while, pursuing additional training, the compassionate bereavement care provider training. Recently had a clinical supervisor role with Center for Compassion, which is specialized in Arizona in traumatic loss with Terry Weibel. And I just find that the work is just so sacred and so deeply meaningful that it's like, how can you not? It would just be a shame to hold that alone. And so throughout my career, I've interwoven my grief work with my other work, but arriving at NARM, NARM has such an incredible way of inviting a grief relationship from self-connection and our adult consciousness, our really intimate way of relating to ourselves. And so it's only expanded that work for me. It's really allowed even more depth and more intimacy and more transformation. And I'm just very grateful to have found that, to found NARM, but have all of my personal experiences, my professional, all kind of interwoven in my practice.
Beautiful. There's something I want to put a pin in, and then I want to ask another question. Like I think I have 5 questions in my head right now. But you named earlier, you've kind of named traumatic bereavement and grief, and I'm wondering if you differentiate between the two or how you talk about the two.
Yes. So grief is any sort of loss that you experience. It's not exclusive to death. It can be any season, any relationship. Pretty much when we open our hearts and connect, there's going to be grief on the other side of that. So it's a very universal experience. And then traumatic grief is specifically the death of a beloved person. And it is different than a natural state of grief that one might experience over something different because it combines the trauma of the event of the death alongside the grief of the event. So it's just defined as a sudden, unexpected, or out of order death. So any experience where someone died in a traumatic way, in an unexpected way, the loss of a child, a violent crime, natural disaster, you can imagine just any time that there's trauma really interwoven and impacted in the loss.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit more about, how NARM and this traumatic bereavement work intersects, and tell us how you bring NARM in there?
Yes. So I utilize the TEND model. It's ATTEND, and that has its own set of pillars, just like NARM does. So that's attunement, trust, therapeutic touch, egalitarianism, and death education. So a lot of those values and interventions just blend so well with NARM, and I can dive into more specifics there. But pausing on that, really the core of the work has 3 different elements. And we talk about being with grief, being with our grief individually and together, surrendering to the waves of grief. So a lot of times as grieving, the pain is so hard, we want to avoid, numb it out. We shame ourselves. We tell ourselves what we should do with our grief. And so the surrender is really just this relaxing into the wave and trusting that you will be okay in it, that it's okay to feel. It's here for a reason, to not be disconnected from it as best to your ability, to invite it. And then also we focus on doing with our grief, which is ritual, which is tangible pieces of how we can honor our bereaved, our beloved people. It looks like acts of kindness. It looks like creativity. It looks like planting flowers or sending flowers at a grave, lighting candles, which I did before our podcast and didn't mention, but I have a candle I lit here with 3 different wicks. And I was holding one wick for Emily and who you're bringing in today, one wick for me and who I'm bringing in, and then one wick lit for our listeners and who they are bringing in while they're listening to this conversation. And all of our important people are with us and a part of us. So just honoring them in the ways that feel right to us.
Yeah, so that being with pillar is obviously so important and clearly is so NARM aligned. Yeah, so thank you for even just in this moment taking the time to be with what's coming up for me and what you're noticing.
Yeah, and it's a really great example of this work. The being with is just so foundational of not having an agenda, just being in the human to human connection together, whatever arises, really allowing egalitarianism, or, in NARM we call it agency, to set the tone for how people grieve, how they continue to love, how they relate to their grief and to themselves in it, to their community, and really exploring and developing that intimate relationship with our grief where after the acute pain of it, there can be this movement and opening into how we relate to it, how we integrate it and honor it. And I always think of this analogy of like a heart breaking open, but it really is this incredible, for me in my experience, this incredible heart opening bridge between each other when we've experienced a loss. And Emily, I'm sure you have your own relationship and maybe some of this resonates, but like when you've had especially a traumatic loss, it feels to me like the superficial or the whatever is not important and not really directly tied to our hearts and what's part of us kind of falls away. In that process, as painful as it is, it's just such a incredibly beautiful experience to be with someone in their grief and to resonate from the depths and your own relationship to your grief.
Can I share what's coming up for me right now? Because there's
Yeah.
something that I'm connecting some dots around, and I just really appreciate what you're bringing here. So I'm thinking back, I guess it'd be 16 years ago, 15 years ago, kind of in the wake of my, traumatic bereavement process, kind of within that first year. And there were people in my circle that I just felt didn't get it, didn't understand. And mostly, actually, I felt there wasn't space for me to feel what was coming up. And I'm thinking back now to that process, especially that first year, there were so many ways that I was gripping and holding on to all the details, all the content in a way that kind of brought me back. I don't know how you would say this, but kind of a child consciousness, because it's no, I need to talk about it and you're not letting me. Whereas I didn't really, these people didn't get it, and that's fine. But I didn't need them to get it, really, to know my own experience. But it is really helpful when someone can sit there and give you space. You know what I mean? But I think now as you're talking about that, I'm thinking about my own NARM journey and the ways that it's given me, I can give myself permission to take up the space and the spaciousness. Whereas before, I just couldn't do that. It's I was so gripping to needing others' validation, others to see. Does that land? Does that make sense? Does that land?
Yeah, so well, actually. I just think it's this complexity and duality. It's our own individual grief process, and then being in society, which is really grief avoidant. If we're really looking at it, all of us will grieve at some point. All of us probably have, whether we're looking at traumatic loss or just a generalized sense of loss. And so when people are meeting you in your grief, but they haven't met themselves in theirs, there's going to be a lot more acting on you, platitudes. Oh, they're just in a better place,
Yeah.
or it's been a year. Why are you still feeling this? Or, just all of these ways that maybe even in their, intention was to help you feel better, to not feel pain. But when you're putting your own agenda on someone else's experience and not understanding that grief is a living relationship,
Yes.
it's alive in us throughout our life, you're just flattening, child consciousness, you're just flattening the space between each other. And then you're just letting people know that you can't hold their experience, their truth, their reality, their state, their all of it, their self, you know? And I'm hearing that with you, Emily, is like there is this part where, yes, we as individuals can really develop and deepen our own grief relationship, and yet we need each other. And even historically, like we grieve in community, like when we can grieve with each other and be with each other and not act out on each other and just really hold each other's experience, then that is profound, profound. And I feel like NARM invites that so beautifully and just so naturally, is this the intersubjectivity of like, let's be human together. Let's invite the space where grief can arise. We're not pressuring it to be here. We're not pressuring it to not be here. We're just seeing what emerges, and then from our own agency relating to it and connecting to what we want in that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I don't know, something inside of me is shifting right now and I don't really have the words, but it's this piece around, like in my NARM experiences, in the client chair, having that space, someone allowing me to just give myself permission to take that space, ironically, then makes it so I don't need anyone else to validate, my experience. That's what is so interesting to me as I'm thinking back, all those years ago of like gripping to needing someone else to tell me that my grief was valid or that what I was feeling was okay. And, that's, I think, been a huge part of my journey in NARM. So thank you for naming that, like helping me like think through that, why that is, because that's really nourishing to me to kind of sit with that.
Then I'm really holding to just the connection, disconnection piece, expansion, contraction, because that's so natural with our grief too. Like we're maybe we have capacity to expand into it, and then maybe we feel more capacity to contain and hold and be with it, and then we contract, and then however that contraction looks like, whether you need external validation from someone, which also is just so important that we get validation. Like I'm not wanting to discount that need either, because that's so true when we're grieving, but just honoring this like opening and closing, and how that doesn't have a timeline. There's this like idea in our culture that like it should be, that should just end at some point. But when you're connecting to your grief, you're connecting to your heart. And so how could it be wrong to have this ongoing heart connection, especially about people or seasons or like whatever you've loved? Grieving is literally loving, in my experience.
Yeah. Well, and again, you're helping me clarify this even further, because as you were talking, I'm thinking, okay, yes, there is a real need to be seen. And I think maybe more specifically, what I'm talking about for myself, again, to clarify for myself, is I no longer need those specific people to see me. That's what it is. Do you know what I mean? It's like, okay, you don't have capacity. I can move on. Like there's other people that can hold this kind of space for me. I can hold it for myself, and there's others who are able. So maybe that feels more true to me as I'm naming it out loud, that I got the information. These specific people just don't have capacity to be with my grief and hold what I'm holding. And that's okay.
Right. Yeah, and that's okay. And it's a hard place to be when people like you have relationship and connection to can't hold and understand or even try to provide space for your grief.
And there's grief in that. Like I'm thinking of that like there was grief in realizing certain people can't hold my grief, grieving that loss.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I have clients who, they experience traumatic bereavement and then their village disappears or they're not met, or they are for a certain amount of time, like a certain season, because, people can try to meet you from where they're at. So maybe they believe, oh, well, this is the time, like this month, I'm going to send food and I'm going to give flowers and but then that time duration dwindles. And so there's this very strong sense of loneliness when you're grieving, and especially traumatic grief where the trauma is also so powerful and you're healing from the actual trauma of it. It can feel excruciating to not have a village. And so part of this work for me is really just the foundation of having the space for someone and being in connection together and inviting self-connection, and hopefully inviting that client to also find other people, like other groups or a different village who can really be with them and not impose,
not shut it down,
flatten
it like you're naming. Yeah. So you mentioned how our society is so grief avoidant. Can you talk a little bit more about that flattening that is a really common tendency?
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of get a sense of it, like we're swimming in it. So it can be a sense of like, oh, I can't cry here, or I shouldn't name who just passed, or it could be, more in your systems where, like you mentioned, oh, like they really can't hold this with me, or there's a certain validation that I'm just not receiving. But I think, in the DSM, there's prolonged grief disorder now that only gives you a year before it's pathologized, right?
Mind blowing.
And so even on like a cultural level here, we're pathologizing grief and saying if you don't resolve it, which what does that even mean? If you don't resolve it by a year, then you have a disorder, and we're just going to treat you like you're ill. When, just for my personal example, I spoke about my loss in 2010, and within this week I had a grief wave that came up, and I mean, over a decade later, it teaches us to sever off parts of what's so important to feel in ourselves and to be within ourselves. And it's so beautiful to have an ongoing relationship to grief. Like I wouldn't change that. I wouldn't want to resolve that. I want to feel the heart of missing,
I love that you said you love that, because I'm thinking about, so I live just down the street from the cemetery where my babies were buried. And so every season, every fall, every winter, every spring, every summer, I take a new bouquet to their grave. And it never ceases to amaze me. Like sometimes I go and it's kind of, and I'll take my little guy, my 5-year-old, and we'll put the flowers in and we'll kind of like walk around, and it's kind of there's like a lightness. And then sometimes I go and there's a heaviness, and I'm always like I always get a little bit curious, like, what is that? What's happening? And it doesn't always coincide with like milestones or, like timelines of like when things happened. I'm always like a little, although that does happen too, like where our body just knows and
Right.
we can feel. But I love how you're describing it. It's like, it's a living relationship, and I'm feeling into that. And so it doesn't always look the same. I'm not always crying and I'm not always happy. It's like 16 years later, it's living and it's evolving. And I just love thinking about it like that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I know a little bit about your grief story, and it's inspiring how you share that with us too. Yeah.
Thank you.
And yeah, I think there's just this part of it where if we're being told by our systems that this is wrong, to continue to feel and to continue to bring curiosity, compassion, gentleness, exploration, expansion, even into what grief means for me, what it looks like for me, how am I holding it, what do I do with it, right? Doing with grief. If we're flattening that and turning that off, then it doesn't create room for, it's just like contraction and avoidance, and doesn't create actual room to expand into the beauty that lives and the complexity that lives in grieving for us.
Yeah, there is beauty in the complexity. Yeah, and you're naming that we can We can make space for all of it. Yeah, that's so interesting. So a year after, supposedly it's pathologized. So I just want to laugh at that. How ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. So I'm just going to name that.
Yeah, it's so ridiculous. And I think that's another part of this is just the primary anger, our relationship to protest. There's definitely a part of this process with clients and with myself, and is like, hey, we deserve, even these approaches that I've learned, we deserve the right to grieve in the way that we define as important to us, even if that looks so strange to someone, even if they don't believe the same. Like, we have a right to self-determine what that is for us, and no one else has the right to tell you different. Like, no one. And so when you're with community who honors that egalitarianism, that is so powerful, because you're just being met in how you hold it and how you define it for you. And that just really deepens into our adult consciousness, our adult self, or even building our capacity to contain and be with it. That protest feels very important in the society that we're in. And it's hard to access when you're being told that, hey, this is wrong. Like, hey, like, get over this. No, you shouldn't be crying. I think that's also been very, very beautiful about the NARM community. Since my level 2, I have really opened up my relationship to being openly tearful and crying and feeling in the depth of actually what I do feel, versus masking it or holding it or believing that I shouldn't have the full range of it. And looking back, I can see from level 2 in 2022 just how that progressed through the modules, and then to today. And there was an Arizona retreat I went to recently, and Emily helped organize. We're just going to shout out Emily here because it was incredible. But just having the permission and giving myself the permission to be truthful and open about how deeply touched I am, how deeply feeling I am when my own experiences come up, when I'm connected to myself, and then connecting and having this presence with others who are also connecting to themselves and gaining insight, and also being with grief and anger. And it's just, there's nothing like that. It's just so intimate and transformative, even transcendental. Like, there's something so magical when we can, not hold ourselves back and just be. A quote that came up from the retreat is radically transparent about our truth, our reality, who we are, how we are as humans, and be in an environment, which unfortunately sometimes feels rare in our culture, but be with people in that experience and held in it in a way that doesn't feel like we need to lock it up or change ourselves or like disconnect from ourselves to be in relationship. It just heals that dilemma. And I've noticed even within the last year, there's been this movement into trust within myself, that I can belong to myself, coming home to like, I do belong in, whether it's my grief, my emotions, my whatever it is about me, my identities, right? Anything like, oh, I actually am starting to believe that I can truly belong to myself here. I do belong to myself and can hold myself. And that also just continues to grow and deepen when you're in relationship and in presence and in moments with others who honor that in themselves and are doing the work to believe that for themselves, and then naming with each other just authentically what comes up.
Yeah. That belonging piece that you're naming right now, I think that's what I was talking about with my own grief, is like, I can belong to myself. I can hold this. And if you can't, that's okay. I will find others who can. But in the meantime, or at the same time, I can belong to myself and I can hold that. And I'm just thinking about at least my process and how that's evolved with NARM, because I know, I think the first grief training I went through is like in 2013 or something. And I was willing to give that space to my clients, but I was not willing to give it to myself. And how that changes the relationship. You know, I imagine there were some who picked up on this piece that like, well, Emily's telling me I can give myself space, but energetically, I wonder how much they were feeling into what I wasn't willing to give myself space for, right? So you're speaking to this piece of like how we as clinicians, when we have our own process and we get in contact with our own grief and give ourselves that space, how it changes how we practice. That's what I'm hearing in what you're saying.
Absolutely. Yeah, because we can intellectually know that, oh, I should hold space for someone. But then when you're not actually holding space and being with your full experience, you're limiting that spaciousness to really like dive in with people. Like I really truly feel that, you know, my experience of traumatic loss, however, you know, different than other people's experiences, there's something about that, and having like been through that dark night of the soul and come out on the other side and continuing to like be in relationship with that, that really invites people into the relationship for themselves, where they don't always have that outside of therapy. I have a client who said that this was like the first time they've ever talked about grief, and they have violent traumatic loss, like shocking traumatic loss, but there's been no space for them this whole time. And so there's, in the therapy room, there's this adjustment period of two of just like building this foundation of trust. And that's part of the 10 model as well, like building trust from the grief lens, but also from the trauma lens. And like, can I be safe to actually have my real authentic experience in this room with this person who's professionally showing up for me? But if you're coming in just intellectually and you haven't been there yourself, like that trust is not going to be the same, because it's a full body experience, especially when you've been through trauma, to really the nervous system to learn that this person is different than all I've ever known. And so it's part of my intention even here is just really inviting therapists, people in this field, people doing healing work, to spend time with themselves. You know?
I do.
And that gives to the clients, to your work.
Absolutely. Doing our work is that building that foundation with ourselves. We can trust ourselves to hold it. They can trust us to be in the space with them. Yeah. When I think about that egalitarian piece that you named, I always think of like companioning. You know, I do feel that when I'm working with a client around grief or loss, there's something a little bit different. And I don't know that everyone would say that, but for me, it feels a little bit different. And it feels more of like I'm just companioning them on this journey as they discover.
Yeah. A friend in the NARM community recommended John O'Donohue's book, Eternal Echoes. And John talks about presence being soul atmosphere.
Ooh, I'm going to need to read that book. Say more. Soul atmosphere.
There's this quote I thought I would bring in. It also speaks to belonging as well. It says, "Our hunger to belong is the longing to find a bridge across the distance from isolation to intimacy. Everyone longs for intimacy and dreams of a nest of belonging in which one is embraced, seen, and loved. Something within each of us cries out for belonging. We can have all the world has to offer in terms of status, achievement, and possessions. Yet without a sense of belonging, it all seems empty and pointless. Like the tree that puts roots deep into the clay, each of us needs the anchor of belonging in order to bend with the storms and reach towards the light, like the ocean that returns each time to the same shore. A sense of belonging liberates us to trust fully the rhythm of loss and longing. It also shelters us from the loneliness of life."
Wow, I'm just taking that in. Yeah.
And then when we're traumatically bereaved, and just in any sort of pain or suffering, what I notice when being with the suffering of others is there's this profound sense of loneliness, of I don't belong, I'm othered, I'm othering myself. No one can know my experience. I'm just completely alone.
Isolation, yeah.
And some of my own past trauma experiences have really I felt into, oh, I am young and I am alone and I'm not cared for.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as much as we can talk about specifics of interventions and what do I do with when someone's grieving, because people will get a sense of nervousness of, I don't want to do harm. How do I do this? What really matters is inviting someone to just belong with you. Like you belong in your experience. And I believe I belong as a human in my experience, and we can step into that belonging together and weather the storms together. But it's been so incredible in the NARM community to like find a sense of belonging in a way that's really supported my capacity to be with people in their belonging, and other communities too, grievers,
Mm-hmm.
queer,
Yeah.
non-traditional, like all of
Mm-hmm.
like there's a lot of communities here, artists even.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there's something like really, really incredible about when you're with colleagues who are doing their own work, depth-oriented work. It's like you feel it energetically. It feels more secure to be in a room with people who have all been doing their depth of healing and creating their own capacity to be with others.
Yeah, it's really nourishing. I wondered as we move to close, I wonder if you have any other stories you can share to kind of illustrate some of these things that you've been talking about.
I have a client quote that I did get permission to share, but it was deeply touching for me. And this this quote I just spoke to you from John O'Donohue kind of talks about the nests of belonging. And the client, I don't know if they've read this book. It was a parallel. It was a synchronicity. But the other day they came back into therapy session after a summer break where they were traveling, and so there's a period of time where we weren't doing NARM sessions, and they've had some training in the community, but they're also really vibrantly connected to a lot of different modalities, and they're just like, they love to like soak in and learn and experience. But their work has been so profound and just such an honor to be a part of, like just incredible. And at the last session we had, they mentioned that during their time away, they felt held in the NARM nest. Like the NARM nest was with them that whole time. And there's something very beautiful about they were not having NARM sessions. Like, it's not like they're every day in this community. They're integrated in lots of different worlds and experiences. But there's something about this approach and this experience of their own transformation and the togetherness in it that they carried internally that whole time.
Yeah.
Like distance didn't matter. They had the NARM nest. They felt held in the NARM nest. And this is a person who hasn't been held before in their life. Like their trauma is severe, And I was like, wow, that it really communicated to me that experience of both like feeling held in the community and also just having such a strong foundation in individual belonging, like just being with self regardless. She could travel, she could not be part of it and still have the both and of that and how they add together. But there's also this Rumi poem that I want to share. Sure. Maybe a quote. Okay. Please. Pulling out all my quotes here.
I love it.
Okay. Bird wings. Your grief for what you've lost lifts a mirror up to where you're bravely working. Expecting the worst, you look and instead here's the joyful face you've been wanting to see. Your hands open and close and open and close. If it were always a fist or always stretched open, you would be paralyzed. Your deepest presence in every small, contracting and expanding, the two as beautifully balanced and coordinated as bird wings.
What a beautiful way to end. Karen, thank you so much for bringing your heart. I knew you would. I had no doubt. But this has just been so rich, and I appreciate, the things you've shared. It's like it feels like you're describing NARM. There's like this quality of like the work that you're doing, and specifically in the traumatic loss area. It's like it transcends space and time. It just feels so meaningful and sacred. And thank you for bringing that to our community.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be here. So excited to be here with you.
Likewise. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. You can also connect with us in other ways. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. As a mental health professional, your commitment to healing and growth inspires us. We at the Complex Trauma Training Center are committed to supporting you in your well-being and success. That's why we're honored to invite you to our Space Program 2025, an inner development program of support and self-discovery for therapists on the personal, interpersonal, and transpersonal levels. Running over 6 online sessions in 2025, this interactive experiential learning program is designed to support self-care and self-discovery for therapists, exploring internally, relationally, and transpersonally. CTTC faculty will welcome you into a professional community of therapists that are seeking to create greater effectiveness and resilience in our professional lives. As CTTC faculty Brad Kammer says, the intent is that this program will help us not only become more effective therapists, but also love our work more. Please visit complextraumatrainingcenter.com and secure your spot in the 2025 Space Program. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Elisa Sponseller for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.